Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly, and today I have a case for you that I don't believe any other true crime YouTuber has ever covered before. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, I don't think anyone else has ever actually covered this case, so it may be one that you haven't heard of before. I have been working on this case non-stop for the last week or so I have a feeling this is going to be a pretty long video. So if you would like to, I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up and also subscribe if you like this kind of content and you want to see some more of it on my channel. I normally do that at the end. I normally say that at the end, but I'm saying it now for some reason. Quickly, before I do get into this video, I just want to let you guys know that this video is very kindly sponsored by June's Journey. June's Journey is a hidden object murder mystery game that is set in the 1920s with a diverse cast of characters. The main character of the game is a woman named June who is trying to solve the murder of her sister Claire by picking out clues, and along the way she uncovers some of her family's secrets. I personally really like the graphics of the game. The scenes are really beautiful, they're colourful, they're creative, and although it is a murder mystery game, I've actually found that it's really relaxing to play. I really enjoy playing June's Journey when I'm taking a break from work or just before bed or just when I'm feeling a little bit stressed. This game allows you to escape and focus your brain on solving a mystery. It allows you to put your observation to the test, but at the same time it's not an overly challenging game, so it's really easy to understand and play. And it is free to download. It's available on iOS and Android mobile devices, so if you want to have a go at solving a mystery yourself, then I highly recommend you check out June's Journey. The link to download the game will be top line of the description box. And now let's get into today's case. Quickly before I do, I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. The information that I've collected for this video has been from several different sources online, all of which are linked in the description box. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So this case begins in Cambridgeshire, which is a county in the east of England, and it took place in 2013. And in Peterborough, which is a city in Cambridgeshire, a 44-year-old man named Kevin Lee has been reported missing by his wife Christina on the 29th of March 2013. Kevin Lee was married and he was a father to 2 children, and he worked as a property developer and a landlord. In fact, he had his own business which was called Quicklet. Kevin owned several different properties in Peterborough, and his business Quicklet meant that he could let out these rooms or rent out these properties to different people, but more specifically quite vulnerable people. So he would let these rooms and these properties to people who had just been recently homeless, or people who had just got out of prison, just people who didn't have much money and didn't earn much money. They would go to Kevin and he would let them rent a room. Or say these people went to their local council and said, I don't have anywhere to stay, I need somewhere to stay. They would direct them to Kevin, to Quicklet. Most of Kevin's properties were in Orton Goldhay in Peterborough, and when he didn't return home on the 29th of March 2013, his wife Christina just knew that something was wrong, because this wasn't like Kevin to just not return home and not let anyone know where he was. And so the police started investigating Kevin's disappearance pretty much straight away, because this was so out of his character and they just had an instinct that something was wrong here. And these concerns for Kevin only got worse when the day after he was reported missing, his car was found on a nearby farm track. However, his car had clearly been set on fire, because when the police found it, I'll put a picture on screen, it was just like his burnt car remains, so someone had clearly set Kevin's car on fire intentionally. Of course, this was very worrying. Kevin Lee goes missing, and then less than 24 hours later, his burnt car remains are found. This implied to the police that something sinister had happened to Kevin Lee, and so they needed to find him quickly. But the search for Kevin didn't last long. Just hours after his car remains were found, his dead body was found in a ditch in Newborough. A man who had been walking his dog along this ditch just stumbled across Kevin Lee's body and he alerted police.
Well, he was just walking up the road and he went into the field and had a sniff. And then he came back up, but then he came back again, which he doesn't normally do that. And that's when I came down to see what he was sniffing at. And I saw this body under this bridge just here where this tyre is. I called the police and they told me to stand the other side of the road and wait for them.
The body was quickly identified to be that of Kevin Lee, and Kevin was actually discovered wearing a woman's black sequin dress. And this dress that Kevin was wearing had several holes in it because Kevin had actually been stabbed to death with a knife at least 5 times in his chest. And these stab wounds penetrated both of his lungs and his heart. Kevin was also positioned in the ditch by the killer in a very humiliating way. He was led face down and the dress that he was wearing had been pulled up so that the bottom half of his body was completely exposed.
What I saw was a man's body laying on the edge of a drainage ditch in a farmer's field, wearing a black sequin dress that had been pulled up above the waist.
It was clear to the police that whoever had done this to Kevin wanted to degrade him and embarrass him and humiliate him. The ditch where Kevin's body was found was in a very remote and quiet area in Newborough. It was literally in a field in the middle of nowhere. And the police just knew that this fact alone meant that it was going to be even harder to find the killer because it's in a field, his body's in a field in the middle of nowhere. It's likely that there's not going to be any witnesses to the crime. Also, because his body was dumped in a field in the middle of nowhere, there was obviously no CCTV around the area, and so they didn't really have anything to go on initially. The one thing that the police were certain on in the beginning was that whoever had done this to Kevin must have known him personally, because this was a personal attack. Just the way in which Kevin's body was found, like I mentioned earlier, suggests that the killer wanted to embarrass him and humiliate him, and they obviously had something against Kevin. And also the way that he was killed, he was brutally stabbed to death. That suggests that the killer wanted him to suffer.
I suspected that somebody had some reason in Kevin's life to do this to him, which begged the question, what's Kevin into? Who's he upset? Who does he associate with?
And so the first thing that detectives decided to do was to look into Kevin Lee's life, just find out who he was, what he did, who he knew, stuff like that. They began looking through Kevin's mobile phone records, and they found that his wife Christina, on the day that Kevin went missing, his wife Christina had been pretty much ringing every single person in his phone to see if they knew where he was. And whilst the police were looking through the numbers that Christina had tried to ring, they found the number for a woman named Joanne-dennehy. And as the police looked into this more, they found that Joanne-dennehy's mobile phone had been around the same proximity or cell site as where Kevin's car remains were discovered at the same time that it was set on fire, if that makes sense. So her phone was around the same proximity as where Kevin's car remains were eventually found on the day that he went missing, and she actually had a connection to Kevin Lee, which we will talk more about in a second. So now Joanne-dennehy is looking like a possible suspect in Kevin Lee's murder, but the police began to question, if she was the killer, how would she be able to carry or drag a dead body on her own to the ditch where he was later found? It just didn't add up, because Joanne-dennehy was quite a petite woman. She was 5'5", and she wouldn't have had the strength to carry or lug around a dead body. But then it was discovered that Joanne-dennehy's mobile phone wasn't the only one that was in the same proximity as Kevin's burning car. A man named Gary Stretch, who was a friend of Joanne-dennehy's, was also found to have been around the same area where Kevin's car was burnt at the same time as Joanne. And when I say Gary Stretch was huge, I mean huge. He was 7'3" in height, which is incredibly tall. He was very big, he was very muscular. He would have had no problem carrying around a dead body. And so at this point, both Joanne-dennehy and Gary Stretch are looking like suspects in Kevin Lee's murder because, well, one, they both had a criminal history, they both had a criminal record, and they both knew Kevin Lee. They both had a connection to him. Joanne herself had very recently been released from prison where she served a 14-week sentence for theft, and Gary Stretch had several several convictions in the past for theft and burglary. And a piece of information that I couldn't actually find online is how these two met. I don't know how Gary and Joanne met. I don't know if they had known each other and been friends for a while, or if they had recently met. I couldn't find that anywhere online. And I'm also not completely sure on the nature of their relationship. I believe that they were possibly romantically involved, but I can't be 100% sure on that. Also, as another side note, this isn't too relevant to the case, but Gary Stretch wasn't actually called Gary Stretch. His real name was actually Gary Richards. He was formerly known as Gary Richards, but for some reason he decided to change his name. I'm not sure why he decided to change his name to Gary Stretch. Maybe it was because he was a criminal and so he thought it would be better to go by a different name. So Joanne-Dennehy was a 30-year-old woman, and at the time of this case taking place, she actually lived in one of the properties owned by Kevin Lee. As I just mentioned, Joanne-Dennehy had recently been released from prison where she served a 14-week sentence for theft, and so when she got out of prison, she obviously didn't have any money, she didn't have anywhere to stay, and so she approached Kevin Lee and asked him for a room. Kevin knew that Joanne had recently been to prison, but he didn't actually know the real reason why. He didn't know that it was for theft. He actually thought that it was for murder. You see, Joanne lied to Kevin Lee and she told him that she had been to prison for 8 years for the murder of her father. She said that she killed her own father after he raped her, which was just a lie that she had made up. She also told Kevin that she ran 2 people over with a car and she burnt 2 more people in a house fire, which again was a lie. To her, this was something to brag about, even though she didn't actually do those things. It was just a complete lie. She was saying these things almost to impress people, which is so strange. But anyway, Kevin Lee didn't know that these were lies. He had no reason to believe that she was lying, and I think he felt some level of sympathy for Joanne and he wanted to help her. Kevin was a kind person. He wanted to give people such as criminals and homeless people a second chance to get back on their feet. And so he agreed to let Joanne-Dennehy stay in one of his properties. He gave her a room completely free, completely rent-free, which he didn't usually do. Obviously, he was a landlord. He normally expected people to pay him to live in one of his properties, but he saw an opportunity here. Kevin decided to let Joanne-Dennehy stay in one of his properties completely rent-free if she and her 7'3" tall friend Gary Stretch would help him in getting his troublesome tenants to pay their rent. Kevin often had trouble getting some of his tenants to actually pay him, and so he felt as though Joanne and Gary could get these tenants to cough up the money because they were quite intimidating and scary. So it was almost like they were kind of working for Kevin Lee.
She was given a free room to stay in and kept her housing benefit, and then just went along to the houses like a thug, just threatening people to move out.
But as well as that, it's also believed that Kevin Lee had a little bit of a crush on Joanne-Dennehy, and so that's part of the reason that he let her stay there rent-free. He would also buy her gifts and give her money, and on one occasion he actually gave her enough money to buy a car, buy her own car. There is also speculation that Kevin and Joanne did have a sexual relationship, but we'll talk more about that later on in the video. But anyway, that was the kind of dynamic. Joanne would stay in one of Kevin Lee's properties completely rent-free, and in exchange she would try and get his troublesome tenants to either pay up the money that they owed Kevin or move out. And it was later found that the day that Kevin went missing, on the 29th of March 2013, Kevin had arranged to meet Joanne at one of his properties. For what reason, no one is 100% sure. It's been speculated that it was for sex. They arranged to meet up for sex, but that was the day that he went missing. He never returned home that night. And then the following day, we obviously know what happened. His dead body is found in the ditch. So Joanne-Dennehy and Gary Stretch are persons of interest at this point in the investigation, and so the police decided to go to the property that she was staying in that was owned by Kevin Lee and speak to her. However, surprise surprise, when the police arrived at the property, Joanne and Gary weren't there. They were nowhere to be found. The police decided just to look around the house anyway, just to see if they could find anything, if they could find anything that could indicate where these two might have gone. And when the police went into the back garden of the property, they found a blood-stained mattress that had just been dumped in the back garden, which of course doesn't look good. A man's dead body is found, and the house that is lived in by the number one suspect has a blood-stained mattress in the back garden, and the number one suspect is nowhere to be found. However, a massive plot twist in the case came when detectives began testing this blood on this mattress, and they were testing this blood expecting it to be Kevin Lee's blood because he was stabbed to death, and so he would have lost a lot of blood. But when it was tested, it was found not to be a match to Kevin Lee. So whose blood was this? And at the same time as this, the police were growing concerned about another man in the area. Another one of Kevin Lee's tenants, John Chapman, had also gone missing. So at this point, one man has been found murdered, another man, John Chapman, has gone missing, a blood-soaked mattress is found, and the main suspects in the case, Gary Stretch and Joanne-Dennehy, are nowhere to be found. They appear to have gone on the run. But before I go any further with this case, I just want to give you a little bit more information about Joanne-Dennehy and her upbringing and her background and stuff like that. Joanne Christine Dennehy was born in August of 1982, and she grew up in Harpenden, which is a town in Hertfordshire. And honestly, she just had a normal, happy childhood. She had good parents called Kathleen and Kevin. She also had a younger sister called Maria, so she was the eldest daughter. As a child, Joanne was described as a very loving little girl. She was very sensitive and emotional. In fact, her mother said that even if she stood on a worm, she would get upset. That's how sensitive she was. But in general, she was just a normal, happy child.
When she was at school, she always had a good report. I never had to go to school because she had a problem. She was polite to everybody. The teachers always said that she was a nice girl.
But then as Joanne began her teenage years, she suddenly just drastically changed. She started not really caring about school. She would misbehave. Sometimes she just wouldn't go to school. She began drinking alcohol and experimenting with drugs. She would often get herself involved with the police for crimes such as petty theft. And when she did actually attend school, when she did actually go to school, she would sneak alcohol in and just drink it throughout the day. Her school friends and just people that Joanne went to school with described her as being very manipulative, but particularly with the boys. She would somehow convince the boys to do things for her, even just like doing her homework. She would somehow convince them, persuade them to do it for her, and if they didn't, she wouldn't hesitate on getting violent with them, being violent towards them. She seemed to develop this kind of power over men. She could very easily control them and manipulate them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. But she would also bully girls as well. She had no issue in school with bullying or threatening other girls. She was just a typical school bully. Joanne got a pleasure out of bullying others. It pleased her to see the upset that she was causing other students. In fact, she would often tell other students just to kill themselves, commit suicide.
What did Jo do?
She might say, when you leave school, I'm going to wait for you in this place, and then you're going to get what's coming to you.
Did she tell you to go and kill yourself?
Yeah, more than one occasion. She'd be like, oh, you'd be better off dead, or, you know, I can help you if you want, and you should just go and kill yourself.
Then, when Joanne was 14 years old, she began a relationship with a man who was 6 years older than her, and this man's name was John Traynor. Now, naturally, Joanne's parents did not approve of this relationship because, well, firstly, Joanne was a lot younger than this man. She was 14 at the time that they started dating, so she was a minor. It was illegal. And so Joanne ran away from home at 15 years old and went to live with her boyfriend, John Traynor. John obviously was aware of the fact that Joanne was a minor. She was under the age of consent. However, he said, and he still maintains to this day, that they didn't have a sexual relationship until she reached the age of 16 years old, until she reached the age of consent.
It's an obvious question to ask because she was 15, but of course the age of consent is 16.
Exactly, yes. I knew the law. I knew what would happen if I'd done anything wrong, and it never happened.
So there was no sexual relationship before she was 16?
No, I'm 100% sure, 100% that I was above board.
John and Joanne were actually homeless when they first started living together. They had nowhere to live. They were just living on the streets. They were living in a tent at one point. They were sleeping rough. And John said that Joanne actually liked this lifestyle. She actually quite enjoyed the life of living on the streets, but John absolutely hated it. He wanted a house. He wanted a roof over his head. He wanted a safe place to live. And then eventually, after a year of being homeless, the couple managed to get a council house, which, as you can imagine, John was so relieved about. And then when Joanne was 17 years old, her and John fell pregnant with their first child. It was a baby girl and they named her Cheyenne. John said that during the pregnancy, during those months that Joanne was pregnant, she was so safe. She wouldn't smoke, she wouldn't drink, she stopped doing all of that because she wanted the baby growing inside of her to be completely healthy. But then once their daughter was born, John said that it all changed. Joanne just kind of stopped caring. She went back to drinking and taking drugs. She didn't really care for her daughter that much. She wasn't overly loving with her or affectionate with her in any way. Instead, when she would spend time with her daughter, she would throw stones at cars with her. She would teach her how to wrestle, but mostly she would just go out and get drunk and take drugs and cheat on John whilst John was at home looking after their daughter.
At worst, I was watching her drink 2 2-litre bottles of vodka and she'd still be walking around.
Did she take drugs?
The first time she cheated on me, she come home 6 o'clock in the morning and basically told me exactly how it went and that she'd snorted cocaine that night.
Sometimes she would just leave the house and be gone for days, sometimes even weeks. And so eventually John just had enough, and 5 years into their relationship, the couple broke up. During this time, during their separation, Joanne went back to her hometown where she grew up, and she just continued her lifestyle of drinking and taking drugs. Then a year later, after they separated, John took Joanne back. They got back together and they went on to have their second child. I couldn't actually find anywhere the gender or name of this child, so I'm guessing that information isn't public for obvious reasons. But just like the first pregnancy, John said that once again Joanne was very safe. She wouldn't smoke, she wouldn't drink, she wouldn't do any of that. And then once the baby was born, she didn't want to know again.
You see these photographs of Jo.
She's stoned there.
So she's holding her baby, who is...
She's just come out of hospital and the first thought of her mind is to look at her face.
Something that I thought was important to note was that Joanne did struggle a lot with self-harm, and I'm not exactly sure when this started for her. I believe it was probably around her teenage years. And I just wanted to kind of pre-warn you, if you go on to Google this case, there are a lot of pictures online of her self-harm scars. I will have put them in this video, but I'm going to blur out the scars so that you can't see them because I don't want to trigger anyone.
She's come round with pins in her arms, you know, needles that are actually sticking, been pierced through and sort of like that and out the other side, and they're all over her arms.
And then all of a sudden she got out a knife and she just stabbed it into the floor in front of John and their 2 children, and she said, "I could kill someone." And it was at this point that John decided once and for all that enough was enough. He knew that it wasn't safe for his children to be around their mother when she was like this, and so he left Joanne, he moved out and he took his children with him. And over the next few years, Joanne didn't see her children at all, I don't believe. She carried on drinking and taking drugs. She was constantly involved with crime. She had spent time in prison. She had multiple convictions for drug use, theft, assault, possession of a knife, and also for owning a dangerous dog. And that brings us back to the case. So just to recap, in March of 2013, Joanne-Dennehy was living in a property owned by Kevin Lee in Orton Goldhay in Peterborough. Kevin let Joanne stay in the property completely rent-free in exchange for her and her friend Gary Stretch helping him in getting the money out of some of his tenants. And there was also speculation that the two, Kevin and Joanne, may have had a romantic relationship of some sort. Kevin was due to meet Joanne at one of his properties on the 29th of March 2013, and he never returned home that night. And then the next day, Kevin's body was found. Meanwhile, another man in the area, John Chapman, who was also one of Kevin Lee's tenants, has also gone missing, and Joanne-Dennehy and Gary Stretch appear to have fled and gone on the run. So just to give you a little bit more information about missing John Chapman, so he was 56 years old and he was a Royal Navy veteran. Like I just mentioned, he was one of Kevin Lee's tenants and he actually lived in the same property as Joanne-Dennehy. They were housemates, so they knew each other fairly well. John himself also struggled a lot with drug and alcohol abuse, and he disappeared on the same day as Kevin Lee. So now, two men, both of which have a connection to Joanne-Dennehy, go missing. One of these men, Kevin Lee, ends up murdered, and the other man, John Chapman, is nowhere to be found. But if you remember, when the police searched the property that Joanne-Dennehy lived in, they found a blood-soaked mattress in the garden. And when they tested the blood on this mattress, they discovered that it wasn't Kevin Lee's blood. So whose was it? So now that the police had made this connection between Kevin Lee and Joanne-Dennehy, she was obviously the prime suspect, but they couldn't find her. But she was clearly a very dangerous individual, and so they needed to locate her quickly, because if she's capable of stabbing a man to death, what else is she capable of doing? So a manhunt investigation was set up to find Joanne-Dennehy and her accomplice Gary Stretch, and in an attempt to find them faster, the police actually turned to the media and released information about Joanne and Gary because they were easily recognisable people, if that makes sense. You know, Gary Stretch was a huge 7'3" giant of a man, and Joanne-Dennehy had a very distinctive, unique star tattoo on her cheek. And so if the police release this information to the public, chances are they're going to be able to find them quicker because the public know what to look out for, who to look out for.
The significant line of inquiry that came out of the public appeal actually came from a police officer in Norfolk. He'd seen the appeal and he was also investigating a drive-off from a petrol forecourt where a girl had gone into the kiosk, stolen some biscuits and food from within and then driven off quickly.
So this police officer in Norfolk gave the detectives in Peterborough the registration plate of this car from the petrol station, and it was found that this vehicle was in fact Joanne-Dennehy's. In fact, it was actually the car that Kevin Lee had paid for and given to Joanne-Dennehy because he liked her, he had a crush on her. So the police took this registration number and they put it into this special computer for like number plate recognition, and they could see the car, they could trace the car, they could see exactly where it was going.
And we could see the car moving and activating on cameras as it was travelling down the M5 motorway towards the southwest.
And it was Gary Stretch and Joanne-Dennehy in this car. They were caught on multiple CCTV cameras whilst they were driving, and also when they stopped at a service station. It was a really bizarre situation because they were on the run, but at the same time it didn't really seem like they were in a rush, even though they probably knew at this point that they were wanted and that they were being hunted by police. They were stopping at shops and petrol stations and stealing food and other items, and one of the items that they actually stole was a camera, and they used this camera whilst they were on the run to take really strange pictures of themselves. I'll insert a couple of the pictures that they took on the screen now, but it was just really strange. They were on the run from police for a murder, and they were taking these pictures of each other as if they were tourists. But anyway, they continued on their journey, and whilst they were driving through Hertfordshire, Gary and Joanne realised that they were running low on cash, and obviously if they're going to go on the run, they're probably going to need money. And so Gary Stretch suggested going to Kington, which is a town in Hertfordshire, and going to visit his friend-ish named Mark Lloyd. I say friends-ish because Mark and Gary weren't really friends. They were more kind of acquaintances, they knew each other. Mark Lloyd was a former petty thief.
Up until that day, I'd never met Joanne-Dennehy, never heard of her, never spoken to her. Me and Gary had a passing relationship because we shared the same jail system. And that's all the connection between me and Gary.
When Gary and Joanne got into the house, they put on the table in front of Mark just a load of the items that they had stolen. So like phones, tablets, just a lot of electronic items that were worth a lot of money. And what did they need? money. And former petty thief Mark Lloyd apparently had connections to people who could sell these stolen goods, and so Gary and Joanne needed Mark to help them get rid of this stock. And Mark quickly realised that he didn't have a choice in the matter. He didn't have a choice as to whether he was going to go with Joanne and Gary, because Joanne actually pulled out a knife and said, "I've just killed 3 people and I want to kill some more." Notice how she just said 3 people. So he literally didn't have an option. He had to go with Joanne and Gary, because at this point he was probably fearing for his life. If he didn't go with them, it's more than likely Joanne would have killed Mark as well. Mark Lloyd later said that whilst he was with these two, whilst he was with Joanne and Gary, it was very clear that Joanne was the one in control. She was the one in control of everything. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier on in the video, Joanne-Dennehy somehow had this power over men, had this control over men, to the point where she could convince them to do literally anything that she wanted them to do. And Mark Lloyd said this was definitely the case with Gary Stretch. Even though Gary was this huge 7-foot man who could easily overpower Joanne-Dennehy, he would do anything that she said. In fact, it's possible that he was actually a little bit scared of her himself. But Mark said that Gary Stretch appeared to be bewitched by Joanne-Dennehy. He was completely under her spell, under her control.
We've spoken to a number of people who seem to be under the spell of Joanne for periods in their life, certainly men in sexual relationships with her. She was very, very capable of getting what she wanted from a situation, very crafted in manipulating people and men specifically.
So from here, Joanne needed to go to Heraford to sell these stolen goods, and she forced Mark Lloyd to come with her and Gary in the car. And so, fearing for his safety, fearing for his life, Mark Lloyd did just that. Mark said that during the drive from Kingston to Hereford, he was sat in the back and Gary Stretch was the one driving and Joanne was in the passenger seat next to him. He said that Joanne was drinking whiskey and she was getting really excited, and she kept getting out her knife and showing it to Mark Lloyd. She seemed to have a real fascination with knives. She was forcing Mark to drink the whiskey and she kept taking pictures of him and all 3 of them. She just was clearly having so much fun, even though she probably knew at this point she was being hunted by police for murder. She just seemed to be having so much fun. After a 45-minute drive, the 3 of them arrive in Hereford, and when they get there, they stop at a little convenience store, a little shop, to buy some cigarettes. Now, Joanne took Mark into the shop with her to buy these cigarettes, and I'm going to play the CCTV footage from the shop they went into.
They came to and robbed the money out the till, and thankfully, strange thing to say, I know, but thankfully she started flirting with her.
But Dennehy's playful mood was about to take a much darker turn.
So as you can see, Mark walks up to the employee and asks her for some cigarettes, and Joanne-Dennehy is stood right behind him.
She's right behind me. I mean, people think she's giving me a hug. She's not giving me a hug. She's got not the blade on me, but she's got the handle on me. And she's saying to me, "Look, Mark, just get the cigarettes."
So he literally couldn't say anything to the employee in the shop. He couldn't tell her to call the police because Joanne was holding this knife against him. She was threatening him. Mark also said that Joanne began flirting with the employee before they left the shop and got back into the car. Anyway, they continued driving through Hereford. Joanne was still drinking her whiskey, and it was at this point that she started saying to Gary Stretch that she wanted to attack someone else. She wanted to kill someone else. She said that she wanted to murder another man. She didn't want to kill or hurt any women or children, but she needed Gary to find her another man that she could stab to death. Mark said that Dennehy just kept saying to Gary, "Find me a victim, find me a victim, find me a man with a dog." And so Gary did just that.
Her and Gary having a discussion, you know, "Gary, you've had your fun, find me a victim." Gary's physically pointed for the witness, said, "What did he do?"
This man that Gary pointed out was 63-year-old Robin Bereza, who was a retired firefighter. And Robin was just innocently walking back towards his home with his dog. He'd just taken his dog out for a walk.
There's one particular piece of CCTV footage on the side of a health centre which shows Robin Bereza walking past, and then in close proximity the green Vauxhall Astra which Joanne and Gary were in.
And that's when Gary stopped the car, Joanne got out and began walking towards Robin with her knife in her hand. Joanne attacked Robin from behind, so he would have had no idea what was going on at the start. In fact, he said that it felt like he was being punched in the back rather than stabbed. Robin did try to fight back, but of course he was a 63-year-old man and Joanne had a knife, so he couldn't really defend himself. And even though this attack happened in a public place, this was literally on the side of a road, Joanne-Dennehy didn't care. She wasn't the kind of killer who cared about people seeing or witnesses or getting caught, it seemed. She just wanted to have her fun. Joanne stabbed Robin Bereza multiple times, and I believe one of these stab wounds was in his shoulder, and after she had finished her attack, she just got up and got straight back into the car, just leaving Robin on the floor bleeding to death. Mark Lloyd, who was obviously in the car and had just witnessed this attack, was of course horrified, and whilst the attack was happening, him and Gary Stretch were actually arguing in the car because Mark was trying to get out and probably help this man or go and get some help, but Gary wouldn't let him. Instead, he just turned to Mark and said, "There's nothing you can do, you've got to let her do her thing." When Joanne got back into the car, she kissed Gary Stretch on the cheek, and as he began driving away, she said, "I want to do some more." And so they carried on driving, and about 5 minutes later, Gary Stretch spotted another man who was walking, and he said to Joanne, "Will he do?" And she responded, "Yes." This next victim was 56-year-old John Rogers, who also lived in Hereford, and just like Robin, John was just innocently walking his dog, which was a whippet, along a cycle path. And once again, Gary Stretch stopped the car, Joanne-Dennehy got out, and just like the attack on Robin, she attacked John Rogers from behind, so she began stabbing him from behind. However, this attack on John Rogers was much more brutal and vicious than the attack on Robin. At one point, John was led face down on the ground, and Joanne was just stabbing him everywhere in his back, and then she turned him over and began stabbing him all over his chest area as well. John was stabbed more than 30 times, and Mark Lloyd said that he thought that John must have been dead. His attack was so horrific. He just thought there was no way he could survive those injuries.
It was like watching something out of a smash or a movie, and I honestly thought the first man was definitely dead, but I thought this man has just died in front of me.
After the attack, Joanne took John Rogers' dog and she put it in the car with her, and then they just drove away. Somehow after the attack, John Rogers actually managed to crawl 100 yards to a public footpath where a member of the public came across him on the floor bleeding to death, and they called him an ambulance. Both Robin Bereza and John Rogers were airlifted to hospital, and they were both fighting for their life. They both sustained life-threatening injuries. But thankfully, after being treated in hospital, by some miracle, both John and Robin actually survived the attack. But back to the case. So after Joanne got back into the car after attacking John Rogers, they drove away, and she began doing the exact same again. She told Gary Stretch to find her another man that she could stab. However, at this point, the police were very close to catching them. They could actually hear the sirens of the police cars whilst they were driving, and they didn't get very far before the police located them. They were only a few hundred meters from where John Rogers was attacked. In total, Joanne-Dennehy and Gary Stretch had travelled 140 miles from Peterborough, where Joanne lived in one of Kevin Lee's properties, to Heraford, where she attacked Robin Bereza and John Rogers. Gary somehow managed to get away. He made a run for it. However, the police eventually found him later that day and brought him into custody. Meanwhile, armed officers approached Joanne-Dennehy in the car, and she was still holding the bloody knife that she used to attack Robin and John. But surprisingly, she was quite calm and cooperative with the police, and she was arrested and taken to the police station. So the police contacted Joanne's parents, Kevin and Kathleen, and told them that Joanne had been arrested for the murder of Kevin Lee and the attempted attempted murder of Robin and John. And I don't believe Joanne's parents had actually seen Joanne in years at this point, because of her behaviour. I believe they just kind of cut off contact with her. So when the police told Kevin and Kathleen what she had been arrested for, they were understandably completely shocked. And it's just so strange because Joanne-Dennehy didn't have the background or the childhood that most killers have. A lot of killers or serial killers grow up in an abusive, violent, toxic environment, and so that contributes to what they go on to do later in life. But Joanne-Dennehy didn't have that. She was raised in a good environment. She had good parents. She went to a good school. She was a happy child. No one could have predicted what she would go on to do later in life. So Joanne-Dennehy was held in custody for the murder of Kevin Lee and the attempted murders of Robin and John. But you wouldn't think that from her behaviour in the police station. So I'm going to play some video clips for you now of Joanne in the police station just a few days after she had murdered Kevin Lee and a few hours, if that, after she had attacked Robin and John.
You are Joanne Christina Dennehy.
Joanne, you've been in custody before, Joanne?
Yes. I love your eyebrows. Thanks.
She's extremely seductive. She has a whole series of tricks.
Attempted murder and Could be worse. A big fat black rabbit.
You could be what?
Big fat black rabbit. Would you be cheery if you got for attempted murder and murder? No, but I'm just smiling.
In these clips, she is just laughing and joking about the situation she was in. She was flirting with the other police officers. And I think that this footage of Joanne in the police station is one of the most disturbing parts of this case. This woman is utterly shameless. She's destroyed so many lives, much more than the police even knew about at this point, and she displays no remorse, no concern for Robin and John, who at this point were in the hospital fighting for their lives. Robin and John were expected to die, but she didn't care. She's just trying to have a laugh, she's flirting, she's making racist jokes. Her behaviour is just so disgusting and disturbing. The following day after Joanne had been arrested, so the 3rd of April 2013, detectives received a call saying that the body of a male had been found in a ditch just northeast of Peterborough, roughly 10 miles away from where Kevin Lee's body was found. And the police were certain that this body was probably that of missing John Chapman because he went missing on the same day as Kevin Lee, and he also had a connection to Joanne-Dennehy. He was obviously her housemate. But then the phone rang again, literally moments after the first phone call. It was the same operator, and he told the detectives that there wasn't just one body in the ditch. There were two bodies of two men. The first body was quickly confirmed to be that of John Chapman, and he, just like Kevin Lee, had been stabbed many times with a knife, with one of these stab wounds going through his heart. And the second man, the second body in the ditch, had also suffered the same cause of death. He was also stabbed multiple times with one of these stab wounds going through his heart. This second man in the ditch was identified as 31-year-old Lukas Labazeski. Lukas was a Polish man who was living in Peterborough at the time of his death, and although he was from Poland, he did have family located around the UK, but I don't believe he had any family living in Peterborough with him. I think he was on his own, which is why he was never reported missing. No one knew that he had even disappeared. The police believed that Lukas was a drug user and that he was probably homeless, so he would often visit like soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and they theorised that this is where or how he met Joanne-Dennehy. A few sources online say that the two, Joanne and Lukas, only met a few days before he was murdered. And although Kevin Lee's body was the first to be found, forensics actually determined through like the level of decomposition that Lukas was the first of the three men to be killed by Joanne-Dennehy. So I'm just going to run through now the timeline of events and the timeline of Joanne-Dennehy's killing spree, because I feel like like if I don't, it will be a little bit confusing. Like I just mentioned, it's believed that Joanne and Lucas met just a few days before his death. Lucas was murdered on the 19th of March 2013, and Joanne-Dennehy had texted him that day and asked him to come round to her place, come round to one of Kevin Lee's properties for sex. So Lucas made his way there, and on the way he stopped at a cash point, which is actually caught on CCTV. One source that I read online said that once Lucas arrived, he and Joanne began drinking together, and at some point Joanne persuaded him to put on a blindfold so that he couldn't see. And it was then when Joanne got out her knife and began stabbing Lucas, and one of these stab wounds, as we know, went through his heart. This murder was very violent, and forensic evidence inside of the property showed that the attack probably began in the bathroom. Once Lucas was dead, Joanne was now in a difficult situation, because where was she going to put this body? Because she was a small 5'5", slim built woman, there was no way she was going to be able to lift or carry this dead body. And so she rang her 7-foot-tall friend Gary Stretch, who, as we know, really liked Joanne. He was under her control, and so he would do anything for her, even dispose of a body. So Gary called an associate of his, 36-year-old Leslie Layton, and he helped Gary carry Lucas's body and put it into a wheelie bin outside a nearby block of flats. I couldn't actually find online any more information about Leslie Layton, like who he was, whether he had any criminal history, how he knew Gary, but nevertheless he helped Gary move Lucas's body. Unsurprisingly, after Lucas's murder, Joanne-Dennehy was very proud of what she had done, and she actually showed a 14-year-old girl Lucas's dead body inside the wheelie bin. I know I'll get questions about this in the comments, but as far as I'm aware, this 14-year-old girl didn't tell anyone about the body in the wheelie bin, probably because she was terrified of Joanne-Dennehy, and so she was scared if she told anyone, Joanne might do the same to her. But Joanne knew that she couldn't keep Lucas's body in this wheelie bin for much longer, because obviously it's gonna start to smell, and so she knew that she needed to move it somewhere else. And so a few days after Lucas's murder, his body was dumped in the ditch just northeast of Peterborough, where it was later recovered. And so at this moment in time, after Joanne had just dumped this body in the ditch, she would have been feeling like she had just gotten away with murder, and she realised that she enjoyed it and she wanted to kill more men. Her second victim was Royal Navy veteran John Chapman, who she murdered 9 days after Lucas on the 28th of March 2013. As we know, John and Joanne knew each other quite well. They lived in the same property owned by Kevin Lee, and it's believed that on the day that John was killed, the two of them, John and Joanne, had just been chatting and drinking together. Some sources online speculate that there may have been an argument or confrontation of some sort between John and Joanne, which resulted in his murder, whereas others say that he just passed out from drinking so much, and that's when she attacked him, because he would have been completely defenseless. But at some point that day, Joanne went into John's room and got out her knife and stabbed John Chapman to death, once again stabbing him through the heart. John was actually murdered on his own bed, so the mattress that was found in the back garden of the property, the mattress that was soaked in blood, that was John Chapman's mattress, and that was his blood. Once John was dead, Joanne rang her friend Gary Stretch, and her exact words to him were, "Oops, I've done it again." Just like after the first murder, Gary Stretch and his associate Leslie Layton helped Dennehy dispose of John Chapman's body in the same ditch where Lucas's body was dumped just days earlier. They were actually led side by side in the ditch. And just hours after stabbing John Chapman, Joanne-Dennehy decided she wanted to kill again. On the 29th of March 2013, she called her landlord, Kevin Lee, over to her flat. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is believed that Kevin Lee had a crush on Joanne-Dennehy, and it's speculated that the two had a secret relationship of some sort, because obviously Kevin was married. And so it's believed that Joanne-Dennehy invited Kevin round to her place on the pretense of sex. It's believed that when Kevin arrived at Joanne's, she persuaded him to put on the black sequin dress that he was later found in, because the dress did have rips in it where Kevin had been stabbed. Kevin agreed to put on the dress. Maybe he thought it was some kind of joke or some kind of, you know, sexual thing, and that is when Joanne-Dennehy got out her knife and stabbed him to death. Kevin was stabbed mainly in his chest and neck area. He sustained really horrific injuries, and once he was dead, Joanne and Gary transported his body in his car, in the car that he paid for and he brought for Joanne. They drove his body to a separate ditch, which was roughly 10 miles away from the ditch where John and Lucas's bodies had been dumped. Joanne posed Kevin's body in the ditch in a sexual position, and they then burnt his car, and the remains of his car and his body were obviously found the next day. And then we obviously know what happens from that point on. Joanne and Gary go on the run. On the way, they pick up Mark Lloyd because they need to sell these stolen goods that they had. And in Hereford, Joanne attacked Robin Bereza and John Rogers before being arrested by the police and taken into custody. And that brings us back to where we were. So Joanne has just been arrested. She's being detained in a police station in Hereford. I hope that all makes sense. I've tried to piece it together in a way that makes sense. So there was absolutely no question at all that Joanne was involved in all 3 murders and those 2 attempted murders. They had so much evidence to say that she was responsible. And the detectives that were questioning her really expected her to tell them everything, because up until this point she had always been so proud of her murders. She was almost bragging about them, and so they didn't expect her to hold back on information. However, in her questionings, she did the complete opposite. She pretty much said no comment to every single question that she was asked about her murder spree.
Did you murder Lushkash Slavijeski?
She's got nothing to say in all of the interviews. She gives no explanation. She gives us nothing to work with.
But that didn't really matter. Police knew that they had the right person. They had so much evidence against her, and so she was charged with 3 murders and 2 attempted murders, and she was sent back to custody where she would remain until her trial. The detectives anticipated that Joanne-Dennehy was probably going to plead not guilty, because that meant that there would have been a trial, a long trial, and she probably would have enjoyed that because she liked hearing about her crimes. She liked other people hearing about her crimes. That was the kind of person that she was. So they were really surprised when on the first day of her trial she decided to enter a guilty plea. And it was also a shock to her legal team, so her defense team. They were under the impression that she intended to plead guilty. So she clearly changed her mind, or she just wanted control of the situation. She wanted to see the shock on people's faces when she pleaded guilty. This was all just a game for Joanne-Dennehy. Throughout this whole case, Joanne never considered the hurt that she was causing other people. She didn't care about that. The only thing she cared about was having her fun. Everything with her was a game. After she pled guilty, Joanne-Dennehy was sent straight to the Old Bailey Court in London for sentencing, where Mark Lloyd testified against her. Mark Lloyd, by the way, was never charged with anything, obviously because he was an unwilling passenger in the car that day. He was forced to go with Joanne and Gary. On the 28th of February 2014, Joanne Christine Dennehy was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, so she will never be released from prison. And Joanne is the 3rd woman in the UK to have ever been given this whole life tariff. The first 2 were Myra Hindley and Rose West. If you want to see me do a video on those 2, let me know in the comments. I can definitely do that. Gary Stretch was found guilty of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 19 years. He was also convicted of 3 counts of preventing a lawful burial of the 3 men that Joanne murdered.
The reason that Gary Stretch is serving a life sentence is because he enabled Joanne-Dennehy to attack John Rogers after he had seen the terrible events of Robin Barretta unfold in front of him.
Leslie Layton was found guilty of 2 counts of preventing a lawful burial and perverting the course of justice, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And a third man, 56-year-old Robert Moore, was charged with assisting an offender because he actually lied to the police about Gary and Joanne's whereabouts when they were on the run, and he apparently provided them with shelter also. Robert Moore was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Joanne-dennehy has since been assessed by psychiatrists and she has been diagnosed as a psychopath. Since being in prison, Joanne has apparently sent letters to various men outside, flirting with them, hinting to them about parts of her crimes. And I also read that she actually planned an escape plot at one point. I also read that she was in a relationship with another female inmate at one point, but I don't know much more information about that. But that is everything. That is the case of Joanne-dennehy, one of the most terrifying serial killers, female serial killers that I have ever come across. Please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. I would really love to hear what you think. Before I go, I just want to announce that the Crime Time podcast is coming back. We're coming back for a season 2. For those of you who aren't aware, myself, Joshua Miles, Kirsty Sky and Dark Curiosities all have a podcast together. Season 1 ended in October of last year and season 2 is expected to start sometime around the end of March, I believe. So be on the lookout for that. If you want to subscribe to the podcast channel, I will leave it linked in the description of this video. You can also listen to it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those places. I'll also leave a link to my fellow co-hosts' channels in the description. They also do true crime, so make sure you check out their channels. Once again, thank you so much to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. If you want to download the amazing game, I highly recommend you do. I will leave it linked top line of the description. I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, I will leave the link in the description box. I'm leaving a lot of things in the description box in this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next time for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.